everyone. Uh, Welcome to the fourth session of Maintenance and Joy lecture series organized by Adriana. Most of you know me, but for those who doesn't, I'm Patti Santos, acting stage 3 leader. I'm also a qualified architect, and I'm very interested in health and well-being in the domestic space. And so I'm very excited to welcome Helena today, Helena Rivera, who's gonna be talking about maintenance, innovation, and ethics of housing. Helena is a qualified architect. She was born in the US. Well, she's Colombian. She was born in the US. She grew up in the Netherlands, and she later moved to London to study architecture at the Bartlett and the RCA. She holds a PhD in regional planning, and she's a visiting lecturer at the University of Greenwich, where she leads a master unit in landscape architecture and urbanism. She's a board member of the local business improvement district and is part of the RIBA mentoring scheme for students. And back in 2011, Helena founded a small studio, and today is made up of four women who I think, I thought they were here, but they are not here now. And their work focuses on community engagement, urban research, landscape, and responsive architecture. But there's no one like Helena herself to talk about their own work, so please help me to welcome Helena to stage.
Thank you, Patti, Patricia, Adriana. I'm going to put the timer on here. So it's really nice to be here. Thanks for coming on a Thursday night for a lecture series. I really appreciate it. I have a big task to talk about housing and ethics and maintenance, which sounds heavy. And I thought we should just start with this. Does anyone know what 40% could indicate? I know you're all really burning to tell me. Basically, if we look at the total construction output in the UK in 2023, 40% is delivering of housing. And that's a combination of private and public. So guys, if you're studying architecture, if you're in any design or construction related field, housing really matters, like really matters. And you're lucky to be dealing with this. Housing is huge. Obviously, it ranges between public and private, and that's probably one of the UK's biggest history or battle is who should be building housing. Who is it actually for? Why should we as designers and architects and developers care? Should we be innovating? And if we should, why? And what on earth does this have to do with maintenance? I think it's a really incredibly relevant link. So these are the things that I want to hopefully talk with you about today, and please interrupt or write down any questions, because the more interactive, the better. But I'll just introduce myself very briefly. This is our practice. I'm sorry we're not here as a full team. There's a maternity leave member, and someone else is ill, and someone else is actually home right now. But that's a small studio, and it's better if I just show you this to introduce ourselves.
A small studio has been in South London for a decade. So when it was time to find a new home, we knew where we wanted to be. While exploring a declining high street with little foot traffic, we found an off-license that had been vacant for years and was in need of some love. A perfect home for a small studio. That's us, right there. Iria, our material specialist. Calliope, our associate architect. And me, Helena, the founder. Our new home represents what we're about here at a small studio. Community, craft, and caring for the environment. This project is no different. We built a place with open doors that invites people in for working, for making, and for meeting. We're revitalizing the neighborhood and bringing people back to the high street. It's a pilot project that can be part of a bigger change across UK high streets. Our craft is focused down to the smallest detail. Just ask Iria, who's created a materials library with over 2,000 samples. They're all catalogued with our in-house passport system, rating the environmental impact they have, with new ones being added daily. It even includes light specs, because I'm personally obsessed with a good light. Or check in with Calliope, our hardcore contract administrator who makes sure her questions never go unanswered. No matter what type of project we're working on, who we're working with, yes, those are bats, or where the site is, because we do love to travel, our priority is always the same: creating projects that know how to age, that care for our planet, and that focus on craft. That's why we're a small studio. It's not about the size, it's about the attention, all made with a lot of love and a lot of coffee.
So sadly, Alice isn't in that video. Alice actually did a sandwich placement with us from Bath University, and she was back at Bath finishing her master's when we did the video, and now she's back in the studio, so she's the fourth member. We have an ongoing ethos that we put on our website that we all know about and that we are constantly talking about and adapting, and I'm not going to run through it, but I'm very happy to go back to it when we maybe discuss it, talk about how we work as a studio, because it is a really interesting and relevant tool that we all use so we know what to prioritize when we're going through projects. So, I didn't even have to try too hard. Did anyone open the news today? Does this ring a bell? I mean, it's just incredible. If I talk about anything around housing, you just have to open the day's news for some tragic accident or news about volume building, about collapse, to be readily available. So on the left is news on the BBC website about a balcony that collapsed, very recently built by Levitt Bernstein. And on the right-hand side is The Guardian talking about a tower block in Bristol that has had to be evacuated. 400 families have been asked to leave. They haven't even conducted a structural survey because it's so pressing that they've just evacuated the tower block. So this is the context in which you guys are preparing to be architects and to go into what is actually a very, very complex and worrying profession, but also incredibly exciting. It's just really important that you understand what you're getting yourself into and where it comes from. So I'm going to try and give you a kind of tiny bit of history. It might be a bit boring, but I promise it's not going to take too long. And I'm going to try and wrap up like 200 years of housing history in 2 slides, yeah? Housing, this is a picture of Covent Garden, 7 Dials, yeah? And this is basically slum dwellings which characterized London before the Industrial Revolution and which forced government into action into creating the first Housing Act. But the first Housing Act was not really a solution to a social problem, it was a solution to a health. UK has always been negative legislation. It's not really about creating positive change, but it's about solving issues which are affecting other people around them. In the case of housing, it was solving a health issue, and it was solving what the poor Elizabethan law in 1563 called the problem of the undeserving poor. So this is the language that has been used in law. This is not something for sensationalism on the slide. This is the legal language with which public housing has been talked about since Elizabethan law. So the housing, town planning, and an act, fast forward, is established because between the Housing Act of 1909 and the growth of London, which you can see is just crazy, between 1850 Industrial Revolution, it starts to spiral out of control. And while this is happening, there's this constant conversation and battle between private developers, central government, who should be building the housing, who is the housing actually for, why should we be building for the undeserving poor? But what happens in the middle of the 20th century is that suddenly a decision has to be made because density has spiraled out of control. A lot of soldiers are coming back, and there's a post-war housing crisis, and there's a massive social reconstruction project to really manage the situation of what is the post-war reconstruction. So suddenly central government decides to manage growth, but what has to be really clear is it's a political decision. It's not a technical one. Yeah? And this keeps coming back. A really, really exciting government plan comes up. I mean, this was probably the highlight for architects and for planners and for designers to be working. Something called the New Towns Act is formed in 1946, and it gets together years of different ideas about garden cities, ideal densities, 15-minute neighborhoods, which was actually down to Ebenezer Howard, that you should never have to walk more than 15 minutes for a really nice quality of life. And the central plan is designed so that London is contained and satellite towns are built around London. And these satellite towns are going to provide many things, communities, balanced communities actually, but what I'm going to focus on is the idea of the housing that they're going to be providing. So it's not just a pretty diagram, it was actually a very statistical, quantified plan of re-densifying smaller villages that were within 20 miles of London and taking away population from London. This also combines with the green belt, but importantly, what it does is it makes central government think about population targets and how we're going to fill these towns with housing, with people that are living in overcrowded situations in London. And that's when two very significant acts emerge, which is the New Towns Act of 1946 and the Town and Country Planning Act of 1947. Has anyone heard about the New Towns Act? You don't have to say, but just like, no? That's really interesting. So for the first time in 15 years, government has talked about new towns again, and that happens this summer. It's a really dirty word. No one wants to talk about new towns. It's full of stigma. It's just not discussed. And I studied new towns as part of my PhD research, and the more you study it, the more fascinating it is. And I'm just going to tell you what new towns do in this single slide. It's incredibly interesting. Architects design, they've got these 22 different towns that they can do a master plan for, design housing, schools, education, healthcare facilities. They make their models, then they bring them into London, and people come and view the models, and then they apply to move to one of these towns in the way that you would have applied to secondary school. They fill out a form and they say, I want to live in Harlow, I want to live in Hemel Hempstead. And incidentally, if you have skills, like if you're a bricklayer, or if you know about electricity, or if you know about laying tarmac, then you kind of get extra points. So you apply, and if you're designated one of the towns, you move there, and there's already a master plan that has been prepared, and you get to self-build your own home. So this is between 1949 and 1962. We're talking about self-building. These guys were way ahead. But not everyone was self-building. You can see that some of it is housing, but then there's also some low-rise towers. There's also medical facilities. It's the first time that GP healthcare centers were established. So some things are built by central government. But what's really important is everything is maintained by a corporation which is actually belongs to government but has someone on the ground. And the maintenance of the new towns was really fundamental to the way that they were working, because it was a really interesting link between central government and the residents that were on the ground. So people were living in flats, people were living in housing, and it was a really nice balanced demographic. Not accidental, because it was all kind of carefully calculated with who could go to the new towns. But generally, new towns, just so you can have some data, built, nowadays there's 2.8 million people living in new towns. There were 22 towns built across England, not England, Wales, and Scotland, because they're different. And just so you can understand the numbers, in 1944, central government was building 10,000 homes a year. Okay, 1944. New Towns Act comes in, and by 1955, they're building 293,000 homes a year. Now, we all know what type of housing crisis we're living in right now. Just imagine that. 10,000 homes per year in 1944. New Town Act comes in, and we're up to 293,000 homes per year.
When did that come?
1946. So, guys, this worked. This really worked. And it pissed a lot of people off in the meantime, because what it was demonstrating is that if central government comes together with a concerted plan, with a management corporation, and helps people move and helps people maintain their homes and their communities, we can build housing. And as the 50s drag on, the 60s, and the political will shifts towards a more conservative Thatcher government, where private property and there is no such thing as community comes in, the idea that central government provides housing goes against everything that central government wants. So one of the biggest problems in the 1960s, late 1970s, is that this housing, a legislation comes in to allow people to buy their own home, called the right to buy, which you will, across your 7 years of studying, hear a lot about. There's many positive things to right to buy, but for local authorities, it created a huge problem. When you have housing estates like this, and you suddenly start dividing homes and saying some of them can be bought and the others have to be managed by the local authority, the way they age and the way they're maintained becomes an impossible task for local authorities. It's very, very difficult for local authorities to keep up with what they call pepper-potted property. Pepper-potted property. They can't deal with estates anymore. They're dealing with large pieces of land where they have only a few different type of housing. And then a few other problems started to emerge. People were talking about new towns blues, a lot of women that weren't working and having babies and falling into depression, and Radburn layouts that were designed in new towns a lot, creating kind of dark alleys and so not feeling very safe, and a feeling of loneliness because people were out in the suburbs. So all of this is debatable, but these were kind of some of the problems that emerged around new towns. But the biggest problem was that there was a verdict given by the media, by journalists, by radio stations, by experts who were consistently, year on year, supporting or voicing what central government fights were about, and actually using housing as the platform for this. And probably one of the biggest and most influential articles came out in the Architecture Review, and it was written by Gordon Collin, who also created this sketch, and it was called The Failure of New Towns. And it had a lot of evidence by planners and architects, policymakers, politicians on why new towns failed. And basically they weren't a success. But from all of the research that I was doing in new towns, the pioneers, the people that had been living there, because fortunately they were still alive, the pioneers, they were very, very positive. They were actually very endearing, and they loved their new towns. And I'm just going to read you a quote from someone, David, who had moved there when he was 4 years old, and when I interviewed him, he was in his late 80s. And he said, there's this huge variety of people who live in Harlow, and you'll find some people who are very passionate about Harlow and where they live, and they love their houses. They won't say a bad thing. I find the negative image tends to be an exterior view of Harlow. People that live in them are actually very proud. The negative image definitely comes later. In my early years as a pioneer, I never felt negative about Harlow. But that negative image came in from the outside of town, from the media, from the press, from the television, radio. We were all listening to radio. People in Harlow, generally speaking, are very proud of Harlow as a new town. I'm going to stop there with the story of new towns. But the overriding idea is that there's a massive transfer of stock from this corporation into housing associations and tenant management organizations and the private body that starts to regulate and take care of housing. And it kind of brings me to this overriding problem or issue that we're trying to work with in a small studio, which is this idea that there are specialists and there are ordinary people. And the specialists are the policymakers, the planners, the architects, the journalists, the ones that know. And the ordinary people are the ones that live there, or the activators, or the users. And one has more power or more agency than the other. And what I can tell from the experience in new towns is that if some of the ordinary people or the pioneers would have been engaged and spoken to at the outset, or when they made the transfer stock of housing, a lot of these management and maintenance issues would have been resolved. And we wouldn't have such a negative and kind of dirty word impression around new towns, because that is what it is. People won't talk about new towns. I'm sure that a lot of you will have heard of eco-towns, or millennium communities, or sustainable communities, or localism. And what you probably don't know is all of those words that I've just mentioned are actually type of housing developments that can only be built using the New Towns Act and the New Towns legislation, but they intentionally avoid saying the dirty word new towns because it's associated with a lot of public housing, a lot of problems around high rises and social housing. So one of the projects that we have worked on in the studio in the past 2 years is actually a competition, which is very rare because we don't do competitions in the studio very often. We only do them when they suit us and when we want to have a conversation. But it was a pitch that the British Council made for architects and designers to design a pavilion, or to be the curators for the Venice Pavilion. And the brief was very specific. It was short, but what the brief asked for was, in the context of the pressing climate emergency, the Black Lives Matter movement, and the global COVID-19 pandemic, we are looking for proposals that directly address the role of architecture responding to environmental issues and social justice. That was what we were asked to do. And as a team, we had just been to Venice to the Biennale, and we saw that brief, and unanimously, it was just so obvious. This was something that we wrote in 2020. We had to talk about the Grenfell tragedy, right? That's what they were asking for. We had to tell the story of 120 families who were directly impacted by the Grenfell tragedy. And I don't know how many were impacted because they lived on the estate, or they lived close enough to wake up every morning and to have the reminder of their community broken up by the Grenfell tragedy. So it was delicate, and we didn't want to capitalize on this discussion about Grenfell tragedy, but we also didn't want to ignore it. So it's a fine line that we had to walk. But what we really wanted to do is use the tragedy as an opportunity to unpack lots of different themes that we had been working with. Families, local communities, systemic social injustice, racial inequality, corporate accountability, building material performance, the maintenance of social housing, the maintenance of housing, and the role of the state. So what we did is we teamed up with Empathy Museum, and we came together with a bid that was going to work with residents so that residents could be upskilled into learning how to make radio programs or small storytelling pods. And they would tell the story about home, which when we talk about housing, we kind of forget that it's actually the home, right? It's where you go to sleep, it's where you wake up, it's where all sorts of things happen. It's private, it's intimate, and you are so vulnerable when the home is broken. So we really wanted people to tell us about home, and that was our pitch. We wanted the residents to use their own stories and their own voices and very gently unpack these very complicated themes through a storytelling of residents and local voices where they become the experts. And what we were really trying to do is we wanted to unpack what the impact is of tragedies when people who don't have a voice are suddenly given a voice on an international platform. So our proposal, which was shortlisted and it didn't go through, but it was a really great proposal for us within the studio. We are going to have a spatial and oral and an artifact-based exhibition where you walk in, and we wanted to have a 1 to 10 model of a part of Grenfell Tower so that we could visually understand what went wrong, because it's so difficult to understand the complexity of what happened without seeing how insulation and cladding and windows all come together and systemically fail. So we wanted to have a tower, and we also wanted to ask residents to help us fill the tower with some of their own local information and some of their home. Then there was going to be a kind of circular movement where our aim was you come in without knowing anything about Grenfell tragedy, and you depart just knowing one story about one family and one impact. Just one. So you would walk through the room where there's local voices, and people from the estate or residents will have created their own stories. Then the back of the room would have been about the inquiry, which is phenomenal. The Grenfell Inquiry is one of the most thorough and amazing pieces of political and archival research that exists. And then something around the legacy, which is where we as architects would kind of explore what is the problem with the profession, what is the role of the profession, what's going to happen if as architects we design and then we stop and we hand over to someone, basically a volume house builder, and they have to deliver the design, and they start making cuts, and they start value engineering the project. Where does that leave us as architects? It's actually very complicated. So that was the room C, which was about the legacy. And it was trying to unpack Grenfell is really difficult. But I'm not going to read the quote. I think you guys should read the quote. This is taken from Show Me the Bodies book by Peter Apps. Yeah. And what it does is it summarizes very succinctly that Grenfell tragedy, guys, it wasn't only a technical failure, okay? there was a huge problem with the TMO, is Tenant Management Organisation, which was managed by the Kensington Royal Borough, Kensington and Chelsea, not listening to residents before the tragedy when they raised concerns about fire safety, asking for plans of evacuation, saying that refurbishment wasn't going to plan. They were shut down. They weren't actually listened to during the fire. And a lot of Grenfell residents from the estate are still not being heard and haven't been rehoused. So there is a massive management problem around what has happened in Grenfell tragedy. So it's not just a technical failure around cladding. And we didn't, like I say, win the bid to be curators. But since we wrote the bid, and since Grenfell tragedy, we have been researching different projects that are kind of emerging or have taken place, and I can really recommend these three. I think Show Me the Bodies is written by a journalist. It's crystal clear, it's plain English, it's probably the best piece of reading that you can do as an architecture student as you enter the profession, because it's so clear and kind of easy to read. I love it. Grenfell is a play in the National Theatre that was playing it at the end of the summer for a month, and it's starting again in March and April. And the brilliant thing about this play is it takes the inquiry and it basically reenacts some of the inquiry in a very distilled and careful and clear way. And the other is the actual Grenfell inquiry. The BBC has done a great podcast on the inquiry where there's 195 episodes. They summarize each of the 400 days. But if you think it's just too boring, open page number 1 and read the personal testimonies from everyone in the Grenfell Tower. They were given unlimited time to talk about their life, to talk about their children that used to play football in the communal corridors, to talk about the fantastic community links they had, how they felt failed by. The testimonies are brilliant. And I think for us it's been a really nice ongoing way of understanding that residents and users are so much more the experts, and we can be so much more the experts if we work with residents and users. So I'll stop there with the Venice Biennale and the Grenfell tragedy, and I'm going to fast forward to one of the projects that we're working on in the studio. It's taking this idea that users are residents. What happens if we completely flip this and we give agency back to people who we're designing for? So unfortunately, the only project I can show you really in action isn't about housing. It's about public realm, but it's a process that we're trying to pilot, which could start to mitigate some of the issues that we have been developing. This is a little road in West Norwood, and incidentally we found out that Lambeth, which is in South London, has money to install sustainable urban drainage systems, basically because the street is flooding. Thames Water can't take any more water in the sewage, in the drainage, so they need sods to take over. And there's different ways of doing that. Either you just repave it with permeable paving, or you close the street and you do beautiful parks and water parks, and you turn it into a pedestrian street. And we know how controversial that would be. So what we told Lambeth is, well, why don't we try to, before you design the street, why don't we just open this up to the residents, to the local community, and go through a process of co-design? Because if residents have a say in how that street is going to be transformed, then maybe they will become more invested and they will slowly manage the street themselves. Maybe it will only part be pedestrianized, maybe it will fully be pedestrianized, but let's just hear what the residents have to say. And Lambeth has been fantastic. I mean, they they said straight away, let's do it. We prepared a little book explaining what SUDs are, because they sound so technical and they're actually quite sexy. Like, you can do so many different cool things with parks and allotments and ecological areas and water features. Or you can just, you know, repave and keep it with permeable paving. So we explained what SUDs are. We had a closed meeting with residents just to explain what the project was about. And then we closed the street for a day, and we had an open workshop where we invited everyone to come in. And we trialed 3 different type of community engagement workshops. These 3 different community engagement workshops were actually getting as much information out of residents as possible, so that they were the ones that would give us the brief, and they were the ones that would design the space. So in a full day, we had 3 different workshops, and in total, we had about 114 contributions. And I'll just show you the 3 separate workshops.
We're on Hannon Road, working as a community, just thinking about ideas of how we can redesign the street that works for residents on the street, local people. So yeah, come and join the workshop, collaging different viewpoints of the street, ideas, materials, how it can be animal friendly and lovely organic materials as well.
As part of Lambeth Council's Big Shift programme, a car-free day was organised here on Hannon Road, West Norwood. A series of workshops were organised to work with residents and local people to reimagine the road and how it could be improved. The first workshop was collage making. Kids and adults alike placed cutouts onto views of the road. This helped visualise how different additions like rain garden planters, green roofs, benches or play equipment would actually look and work on Hannon Road.
This is really nice.
So, let me just move this. This collage making was...
Hannon Road, working...
There. This collage making was very revealing. I mean, we provided the stickers, so in a way we were already guiding people as to what they could incorporate, but we had 4 pages with technical elements, ecological elements, landscaping elements. Afterwards, we did a kind of word map to see what people were recommending more of, and we separated the adult contributions from the children contributions. We're carrying out another 3 workshops to bulk up the contributions. But they were really phenomenal, and they were actually very detailed. We cheated a little bit and made a 3D model of the street, and instead of showing an actual 3D plan, we exploded 2 versions and stitched them together in Photoshop so that you can read the facades of the buildings and people could really relate to them. And it means that children knew exactly where they were making their contributions and putting notes in. And it just helped people who might not read Ordnance Survey or just GIS maps. But they were very detailed. They had some great ideas. And we're using these. We had a view from one side of the street, from another side, and from the top side, and we're using them to start the design process, but with a really rich brief. Then the second one was about doing a desire line survey.
The second workshop was collective mapping. To improve Hannon Road, we need to know how people are using it now. Desire lines were drawn on a map in different colours to show how people use and move through the street. We recorded where they were going, why, and whether it was to their home, a cafe, to a bus stop, or the train station, for example.
Great, I'm going to move on quickly. We had 17 contributions and we had basically printed out a huge map with really clear instructions on the left explaining what a desire line survey is, why we're using it, explaining how people should make their own legends and anonymously tell us, are they local, are they child? And we had some amazing insights and kind of like patterns that emerged from this survey. And then the last workshop that we did on that day is called Show Us Your Area.
This with this, sort of collate what people are feeding back to us to see what we can do with this space.
The third workshop was called Show Us Your Area, to help better understand the character of the area and what people already liked about it. We collected images taken nearby by residents and other people using the street based around 3 themes: architecture, activities, and nature. A Polaroid printer was set up and used to instantly print out photos taken with mobile phones. After a few minutes for the photos to develop, we could hold them in our hands and see displayed all together what mattered to people.
So those 3 themes that we asked people to take a photograph of actually came from Lambert's own technical guidance. They said that they want to develop programs that are representative of a local area's characteristics and work to the activities local residents like to do. And we asked, well, how are you getting these characteristics and how are you going to know what activities? And they knew they needed that, but they didn't actually know how they were going to get it. So we took the technical brief and deconstructed it and said, right, let's just get the information, the kind of grounded information first, so that then we can rework on this technical brief. And it was very useful. We had the 3 different sections, then we had areas for post-it notes, and this is now being worked into the technical brief. So we're in the process now of developing a design for that, and we have a nice number of local residents that are engaged and that are, willing to work with us throughout the process, but we're going to keep doing a few touching in sessions or open surgery design sessions in the studio so people can continue to be engaged. Which leads me on to maintenance. The maintenance and joy, the joy of maintenance. I should have probably started the talk with this because it's always nice to check your brief by looking in the dictionary, what your tutors actually want, right? So if you look at maintenance in the dictionary, it's the act of preserving, okay? It's continuing to have, it's preserving, and it's a part in our profession that has been forgotten for many years. We tend to spend a lot of time writing the brief, designing, detailing, going on site, and then handing over. Unfortunately, that's changing. It has been changing for the past 10 years. It's reflected in the RIBA plan of work. Is anyone familiar with this? Yeah? So you will become best friends with this. This is gonna kind of guide you in the profession as to how you should be working. But this stage 7 is a relatively new stage. What it does is it says the building isn't finished when you hand over. The building is finished when you hand over and it's been in use for a certain amount of time. And then you go back and you certify that it's been used properly and that it's been maintained and that it's safe. And that's what is called the stage 7 in use. Okay? And you can see it reflected in some of the awards submissions. For example, RIBA awards, you can't actually submit a project nowadays unless it's been in use for 12 months. So back when I was a student, the lab and the dance center in Deptford won the Sterling Prize. And I happened to go there for a workshop, but none of the dancers could rest between their sessions in the open space, because the open space was this really cool hallway that was a kind of angled platform, and I'm sure it looked great in section behind CAD, but when you've been dancing 5 hours in the studio and you just need to stop and rest, none of the floors were even. And the building had won the Sterling Prize, but the users couldn't actually use the building. So this is in part why the in-use phase has become really important, and why the RIBA is saying, well, you need to use it before you can apply for awards. We try to, in the studio, before we design, whether it's private, public housing, we always try to do a very detailed sustainability assessment, because through sustainability we can see what the overriding end use and lifelong use of the house is going to be. And these icons on the left are small icons that we've been developing with a really simple, plain English kind of language for private residential projects that we have. Things that people can afford, people can talk about, because it's actually quite hard to upgrade London housing stock. So, you know, central heating, type of appliances, type of materials you use. We try from the very beginning to really consider the impact of the construction and the materials that we're specifying, because the end use and the way that the buildings are going to age all depends on the type of materials that you're specifying. And like you saw in the video at the beginning, we've been developing this materials library. So we're doing little passports for materials, and we're grading them on their sustainability value and where they can be used in projects. And it's fully internal, but it's open to people in West Norwood. They can come and they can look, and they can actually touch and feel these and understand why one type of brick might be more sustainable from another one by Ibstock. And then when we are approached by clients for any project, but mainly for residential housing, we explain really clearly those RIBA stages of work in a way that is relatable for housing projects. So we explain about the need of doing a very detailed design feasibility, then stopping and going into a design development where we tailor the brief and we make it a little bit more narrow. All of the different options for planning, which is a minefield in itself. So is it going to be a long planning process, a short planning process? We spend a lot of time explaining to non-experts why technical stage is so important and why drawing projects to death actually improves the success of the project. The more you can do before going on site, then the better and the more enjoyable the site work will be, and the better performing the building will be. How we approach different contractors. So we often get asked, can you just tell us what contractor we should approach from the very beginning? And, you know, like designers, contractors have strengths and weaknesses, so we need to know what project we're dealing with before we can start to recommend. Some are really good with carpentry and joinery and have a great workshop. Others are very good with excavating very deep foundations and have a lot of steel work. So speaking to contractors is a whole different stage. And then supervising, this is part 3 of architecture when you go on site and you start to supervise projects. And you'll probably see here at the university when you go to your exhibition and that end of year show, it's that same rush, except it's not, you know, a week preparing, but maybe 6 months. And then lastly, this stage of in use, explaining to the client how they have to use their new project, how they have to maintain it, to make sure that all of the different management procedures are being followed. And that's usually when we wrap up projects. It's at the end of stage 7. And that's where I'm going to wrap up. So, conveniently. I'm going to finish there. I was asked to speak for 45 minutes and I'm 3 minutes over. So, sorry.
Thank you so much, Helena. So now, you want to come here with me? So now we have questions from students.
Okay.
We gathered some of them, but we are gonna, maybe we should start with questions from you guys, and then I can read the ones that I have, yeah? Or
maybe some of the ones that
they are here. Okay.
so
Okay, maybe I start.
they can do it themselves.
Yeah. Anyone wants to start, or should I read these? No? Okay.
I have a question. Where did you get the idea of...
Oh, sorry, 1 second. I'll give you them. No?
Because we are recording, sorry.
I've been forced to have a mic. You should have a mic.
Sorry.
Yeah, I have a question for you.
Okay, now let me really think about the question then.
No, don't overthink it.
Okay.
The spontaneous ones are the better
Yeah,
ones.
it's just,
When you were explaining the... kind of like talking to the residents and implementing a design process, that kind of brought me to what Eames' designing metaphor was, like what he wanted to do, just kind of like design through practice and practice and practice of doing it, and the people that actually live in those homes is the ones going to use it. So I just wanted to ask, how did you, see, I don't know where I'm going with this. My question was,
How did we come up with the process?
kind of how you...
Lectures are really misleading, guys, because it feels like a very linear path, and it feels like a very natural decision-making process. But I promise it's not, okay? And actually, through the experience of doing certain projects, you always learn lessons. And if you have time to stop and reflect and be critical about the lessons you learned, then the next project you'll be able to reapply them. So for us, approaching Hannon Road with a really clear view of we need to work with the residents comes from a place of just knowing that if Lambeth says we're going to close the street and pedestrianize, it's going to be so controversial, nothing's going to happen. And if they say we're going to do allotment gardens or rain gardens, people are going to be disengaged from it because they weren't asked for any advice, so they're not really going to take ownership of their own space. So that's why we thought, well, let's start working with them from the beginning and ask them to join us, for them to have ownership, for them to design. Some of the things that have emerged have come entirely from them. But we only really knew that because we've been researching and working on these projects in the studio.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah.
so you partially answered my question, actually. I was going to ask, do you have any design ideas before you do those workshops?
Yeah, I do. And I think we probably all do. And one of the hardest things is to know what they are, but not let them make the consultation biased. So you kind of have to know what your ideas are and set them aside, and then try to really work with a format where people are going to be able to tell you what they want to tell you. And in fact, the partnership we made, which was really interesting, it was a university, the BID, the local authority, they had ideas and they kept saying, well, you need to make a sticker of this. But I knew if we made stickers that were too focused, or, you know, like bicycle storage with a green roof and water outlet all in one sticker, then we were telling people. So we really had to kind of stop and say, wait, let's just give people the opportunity to tell us. But yeah, I'm a designer, we're all designers, so you always have something in mind beforehand. And that's
so you are not really radical with your idea before those workshops, because you know that it might change after their thoughts.
I think in my case, yes, but because the way that we're designing in the studio, the way I'm designing is always problem solving and responding to a problem that I've been given. I don't have some kind of agenda or manifesto or star architecture style that I want to impose. I'm just really solving very specific problems. So first it's nice to know what the problem is.
That actually relates to one of the questions that I have from the students, and it is how does the studio adapt to evolving design trends while maintaining the studio identity?
Yeah, wow. This morning I was having a conversation with my colleague who showed me that Microsoft Bing has opened a new type of AI that works with DALL-E, and you literally put in 7 keywords and a style prompt, and it creates very sophisticated renders. And we have no idea where this is going to take us in our profession.
Yeah.
But we talk about it all the time. I guess in our studio, I've put this on intentionally because, like I said, knowing what the ethos is for us is really important. And knowing when some technological advances will affect the way that we work and the way we communicate with our clients, that is really important. If it's technological advances that are just like AI, where we're generally interested in them, we probably don't persevere very methodically because it's conversations that we're having in the background.
Yeah.
But it is difficult and it is evolving quickly.
Yeah.
And I guess working with a good team where people have different interests is fundamental to always asking yourself how to improve and upskill.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. We can't ignore that this is happening, but yeah. Another question. Is there, okay.
Sorry, my question is more or less about the policy and policymakers. So I can't articulate what is the problem, like, because I guess the policy is to make architects meet some standard, and the idea behind this is like to make it good, right? So like I'm wondering why, I know that the users are the one who's going to use this space, but policy should be the I don't know, the boundary for the developer where they cannot cross, or like I don't understand why when you say about the policymakers that they were in a group of experts, but they kind of should stand behind the user, and the problem is that they don't, or like I don't know even how to articulate the question, but do you kind of follow me, or?
Is the question, why do I think that experts, local people, should be considered experts?
Why we cannot, like why the policymakers don't make right decisions, like why the policy is not
Yeah, okay,
good.
Yeah.
Yeah, more or less.
Yeah. I think, I think it goes back to what I mentioned at the beginning, that housing, in this context it's housing, it becomes a political debate. It's not a technical debate. It's not actually about solving a housing shortage. It's a constant battle that gets played out in many countries. So it's not just in the UK, but we're in the UK, between what is the role of central government versus local government. Our communities where we help and we have a welfare state that supports, or where we care for ourselves, and the harder we work, the more money we earn and the bigger house we have. And it's an ideological battle constantly between left and right. And housing and planning, unfortunately, becomes the platform where this battle is played out. So it's not that the intentions aren't there of policymakers, but the minute that you have a shift in government or a shift in ideology, then it gets mirrored and manifested in the housing and the planning system. The problem for us now is it's come to the point where volume house builders have such a huge stake. They are the only people delivering housing right now. And volume house builders are not interested in welfare conditions or helping people. It's a profit-driven business. And they're land banking and they're building for profit. And so their intentions are going to be very different from if it's the central government providing housing.
Actually, off the back of that, I found it interesting, your points on stage 7 and its importance. And do you maybe think there could be benefit for there to be another RIBA stage, so that there is more of a focus on the use of the building and the responsibility of the architect in a more long-term kind of role?
Yeah, thanks. That's a good question. I think there is. I mean, the thing with the architect is that the role of the architect is constantly under fire. Our role is no longer protected, so our title is protected. You can't say that you're an architect if you haven't done your Part 3 and qualified under ARB, but you can apply for planning without being an architect, and you can make technical drawings without being an architect, and you can actually build housing for 120 families without being an architect. So in real terms, when you're working in the field, it's very difficult to make a living as an architect, because if the activity isn't protected, people are and I say people as in like developers and in the building industry are constantly asking, well, why are we paying services for architects? Because I don't actually need the architect. So in answer to your question, if we keep expanding the role, it's going to be even harder for us to justify why we need to be involved in the construction profession. But I agree that probably conceptually there are other stages where the architect could be working, yes.
Helena, do you normally do post-occupancy surveys?
We do in an informal capacity, because the work that we're contract administrating is private residential.
Mm-hmm.
So there is, under contract law, there's the end of defects and then there's completion. And we obviously stay in touch with the users, and we get phone calls and we ask how things are doing, how they're going, and we stay in touch with the contractors. So informally, we're doing a post-occupancy survey. Officially, we're submitting at the very end of the stage 7 a set of drawings as built, a set of manuals and instructions that we've reviewed and we've given to the client, and a set of completion certificates, which are requirements.
Yeah. That is a process that normally is, people think is purely bureaucratic. So it's like you do that, or normally some architects do that in a rush way, and it's mostly the contractor gathering the information, and it's not. Normally, architects don't take care of that stage that well, because you you want to finish, and it's like you want to release that information, and it's a shame because it's a very important part of the process, as we were saying.
I mean, just to answer your question, Grenfell Tower was refurbished, which was the main kind of technical cause of the problem. It was refurbished with cladding. So nothing structural or the integrity, the internal layouts weren't changed. The evacuation strategy wasn't changed. It was refurbished by adding new insulation, new aluminium panels, and then wrapping that and carrying it up to the top and then creating a kind of crown. It was purely cosmetic.
Mm-hmm.
There was no structural reason to have done it, and it was just to improve what was a kind of blight in Kensington and Chelsea of a tower block with a nice new facade. And one of the criticisms in the inquiry is that no post-occupancy survey was carried out. And one of the defenses of the architects is that they were not appointed as architects because they did that refurbishment under what's called design and build. So instead of doing the 7 stages I showed you, they actually did stage 1 to stage 4, and at the point of doing stage 4, they stop and the contractor or the developer continues, and they do their own design. That's why it's called design and build. They do their own design and they do their own build. So the architect isn't actually involved anymore. And it's a really blurry, legal, contractually legal, complicated way of procuring buildings because there's no independence anymore.
Yeah. Yeah, there is a huge, I mean, we could be discussing about the role of the principal designer and, yeah, all of this. And, but this is for Adriana's.
For the joy, for the joy part of the module.
Yeah. Any other question? Yes.
I can just shout. So my question is kind of twofold. Part of it is how recognizable is the authorship of the user or volunteer designer from the community, like engagement stage, in the final design? Because while you can like easily problematize the idea of like the knowing architect and the kind of ordinary person, there is surely some kind of value in the sheer exposure to design ideas that architects have, which gives them some kind of, you know, precedence in design. And then, secondary point, how do you implement the user feedback which you get from the post-occupancy survey? Because surely user feedback is more useful when the design is in use.
Yeah, yeah. Your first question is a really good question, and it's something that we are constantly working, and I think it's the opposite of your question, but it's about how do you incorporate authorship of community engagement. And I'm not going to answer about authorship of me as an architect, but authorship of the community.
Yeah.
Because what happens in these workshops is a lot of time residents and local users, they're not paid for their time in the way that I, an architect, would be paid for my time. And it's expected for them to join in and collaborate as a volunteer because it's for their own benefit. So one of the things, and I didn't mention it in Hannon Road, but the second stage with Hannon Road, which we're doing on another street, is to carve out finance so that we can pay residents for the workshops and for their ideas as they kind of participate. And that's really important in in research and architecture projects and university projects. When you're writing briefs and you're talking about engagement, you need to really, you know, treat and value the knowledge, both in terms of authorship and also in terms of time and finance. People need to be paid back for what they're offering. And I think when you start doing that, then you can really you start treating the kind of experts and the ordinary people as equals. And then your second one was?
How do you implement user feedback?
Yeah. You can implement user feedback at the end of a cycle because usually the user feedback would be either about management of a site or about building material performance. And obviously I think basically as designers and as architects, we're kind of equipped to problem solve constantly. And sometimes the feedback can be quite small, user feedback, and might require some minor changes in material, and others might be slightly bigger. And then you just need to find a way of resolving that, and what we call retrofitting. But we've never had to structurally, in one of our projects, we've never had feedback, user feedback that has forced us to redesign anything in the project, but we have had feedback that impacts our next project. I can hear you.
That is being recorded. I would love your questions to get kind of heard in the video.
First of all, thank you so much. That was such a scopy presentation. There's so much to think about, so I really appreciate that. I want to ask you about sort of the complexities or contradictions, and in a way this is quite a philosophical, axiological question. And I think it relates to my own sort of romance of maintenance and social reproduction, and thinking maintenance is a wonderful thing. It hasn't been prioritized, we now need to prioritize it. But actually there's a lot that we don't want to maintain. Many of us don't want to maintain advanced capitalism, for instance. And I guess something I'm thinking about is how when we are gathering these voices of people who have experienced extreme injustice, this is a question about energy. There's a kind of like concentration of energy that happens when people tell their stories that then means that the energy of their struggle dissipates. And I want to understand how maybe those of us who are working in this way are complicit in that, and then inadvertently complicit in propping up advanced capitalism. Does that make sense?
I think so. How you can capture the energy of engagement and make sure it doesn't dissipate?
That's right. So something like Grenville, for example, I mean, these are long struggles. Like, the people who have skin in the game have to struggle and struggle and struggle.
Yeah.
Similarly, for people who are reconfiguring their neighborhoods, that's a long process. And as you said, they're the major stakeholders. They're there.
Yeah.
And my worry is that those of us who are involved in these moments where we capture feedback actually maybe are doing the very people who want to be serving a disservice because the energy is concentrated and then dissipates. And so this question of how you maintain energy for struggle is, I guess, something that I'd love to hear your views about. And then additionally, how do you regard maintenance within your own practice? Like, do you have a ratio that you're thinking about? Is it about time, energy, money? How does that work for you? So maybe two questions there.
Yeah, okay. Two small questions. I think the first one about, I think your first question I have interpreted it more as activism. And what is the power and purpose of activism in our profession? And do we want to be activists for causes that might be racial inequality, social inequity, or do we want to just work within our field and design and keep our head down and innovate through technical innovation? That's how I've interpreted your question. And I don't know if it's the right interpretation. For me personally, and for us as a practice, I've been told to not be political, for example, on social media platforms, and to keep politics out of the studio, which I think is a fair request. When you work together as a team, sometimes some people might be more political than others. And I kind of use my activism through constant reflection and learning lessons and monitoring of projects that are happening in the studio and outside on the streets, and then try to bring those lessons into the practice. But not really through a kind of outspoken political activism in the practice. So I think there are ways of capturing energy and not making it a disservice, but kind of learning lessons and then reapplying. And I think not avoiding certain subjects is a really important, is something that we have to do as professionals. I mean, we had a lot of debates in the studio, like how do we approach the subject of Grenfell tragedy without it becoming a sensationalist or being insensitive. We can't just not talk about it. But if we do talk about it, how can we do it so that it's not insensitive or rude or generalizing about life in tower blocks? So there was a lot of conversation around that, and we partnered with the Empathy Museum partly because of the way that we wanted to maintain the energy but not be insensitive. But we just had to address it. So I think you should probably try to capture the energy and just find a way of moving forward so that you're applying some of the lessons from that energy into the next project. I don't know if that's what you had in mind.
I think it's a really challenging question, so I appreciate your response. Do you want to answer my second question?
Remind me your second question?
Yeah, it relates to how you basically approach the maintenance of your studio. And I guess I'm thinking about it specifically from the perspective of practice, how it is that we sustain practice when we have so many other challenges, like even banal things like life admin that can often get very big and crowd things out.
I mean, this list I've put up behind me is one way that we keep maintenance. We've had this thing in the studio called the NHS. This is before COVID. Now it feels like a market spin, but it's not. And the biggest challenge in practice is that you design something and then you need to make it happen, so you have to start cutting down, what we call value engineering. And the NHS is a way that we ring fence an element in a project. And we say, okay, this part of my design is so important that whatever happens to the design, we can maybe lower the budget on one area, on another area, but we're going to ring fence and turn this part of the design into the NHS. And maybe overspend on that part of the NHS and underspend in others. And that way we can ensure that all of our work has something special and a kind of a feeling of wow, or as my colleague would say, so that it pops, right? So for us, identifying the NHS of every project is really important because we know that things are going to be value engineered. And that's one way that we've maintained joy and happiness, because if you are working towards the budget, the market, the contractors, the inflation constantly, then you have no joy in practice. And then the other one is having an ethos of how you work together as a team. You know, it's a limited company, I'm a director, but aside from that, it really is a platform where we are 4 very different people. One is a design historian working in the V&A, the other architect is really interested in theater design. Someone else isn't as interested in the community work, but is really interested in the technical and housing and contract admin. And then I'm fascinated with community work. And that's another way of maintaining, like diversifying who you work with.
Helena, you work mostly with private clients, but you have a genuinely, like, you really care about a community, and is this something that you see? Do you work with private clients for maintenance of the studio? Do you see yourself in a few years opening, like, be more open to public projects, or do you think you will still need, as a practice, to have your private projects to sustain working with community?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. It's easy to be pigeonholed very quickly and to say these people do public realm, these people do private residential, these. Mm-hmm. So constantly working against that is important to me, like maintaining a nice diversity of kind of things we work in. But I love working in private practice, and I would really hope to always work in private practice in a way where it makes up like 40% of our fees. And that's because you're working one-to-one with people, you're working with real problems, and you're seeing projects through. In 12 months, I meet people, and 12 months later, I'm kind of like in the space. And that's really exciting, because when you're working in public or bigger housing projects, you can easily spend 12 months like detailing toilets and cladding, which is fascinating as well, but it's a different type of architecture. You become much like a cog in a much bigger machine, so it's harder to enjoy all of those 7 stages.
I'm very glad that you are being honest with this question, because it's something for me, it's like a stigma. Like, yeah, it's like it feels that architects who work in the private sector with private clients, we don't care about, social problems, and you can balance the practice and find that doing other type of projects, like the ones that you were showing us today. I have another question. If we have 1 minute, is there any other in here? Any other question?
Can I add something in that
minute?
minute?
Sorry.
This stems from a conversation I had with Adriana about private practice. I genuinely feel that most of the technical innovation happening today is coming from private practice. And don't underestimate the excitement and the ability to innovate when you are working with a small problem, with a real user, with a budget. And if I could unpick in our research work, in our community work, ideas that have come from smaller pilot projects that we've done on site, there would be many. So private practice has its benefits because people pay promptly and they're kind of fees that keep a studio working. But intellectually and technically, they are incredibly challenging and they're really exciting. And a lot of the real innovation that's been happening in the field has come from small projects.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, Adriana.
If you don't mind, guys, because we started a little bit late, can we have 5 minutes to wrap up?
Yes.
Because I have a question.
Of course.
For Eric. So I really need this one. Thank you very much. Helena, just first of all, thanks so much for that. I not only love your presentation, but I love the questions, and this has been such an important, I think it's a very important discussion, especially if you're a student of architecture. But following from what you just said about innovation being possible because of all the conditions attached to private commissions. If Labour came to power next year, and as you said at the beginning, hopefully, if as you said in the beginning, right?
5 minutes.
It was if Labour came to power, they are the ones who have reintroduced the dirty word, new towns. Then Keir Starmer comes and says, Helena, we want you to design 15 new towns. What are the lessons that you have learned from your private practice that you think you would be able to incorporate in that design, and knowing the process of new towns as it has happened before historically? How would you do this? And do you have the legislation, or would you have to change some legislation? How would that new towns for the 21st century Britain work?
Newtown's legislation is there and it's incredibly flexible. And like I say, we are still building from legislation from 1946. So the legislation is there. There have been some really good inquiries. I mean, if there's one thing that the UK is brilliant for, is inquiries and transparency in information. So there have been some really good inquiries about lessons of new towns, some statutory documents. They're made available online. There's this thing, I don't know if you guys know, called Hansard. Has anyone heard of Hansard? Hansard has digitized every single debate held in the House of Commons since 1605. So you log on to Hansard and you say housing, you type in housing, and you get a list of every single debate since that date. And you can see graphs, you can see the nitty-gritty detail. In part, it's because of common law and the fact there's no constitution, so you have to build on what has happened in the past. So having access to the past is important. In part, it's just because the UK has a fantastic transparency of public service, really. So the information and the lessons are there. There's some really key lessons or changes, for example, which tie in with one of your other speakers who I think spoke about infrastructure. One of the biggest problems with new towns is they were expanded from small villages, but not all of them were attached to a train station. So the minute and they had targets of 200,000 people, the minute you take 200,000 people to a place where they can't commute unless they have a car, then you're really developing a type of urbanism, and that was a big change. That was a big problem. And the other problem was that there was a little bit too much government control over the type of industries that would move there. So they kind of did tax incentives for companies to send factories and provide jobs, but they weren't real structural jobs. They were temporary factories. So as soon as they start closing down, people lose their jobs and they can't upskill and they can't commute. So not having too much involvement or top-down central government control over how the towns are developed is important. But I think from the point of view of housing, acknowledging that that volume house builders have too much dominance right now in providing what is like a fundamental bedrock of a welfare state or of any country. Acknowledging that housing shouldn't be designed, built, and managed by private companies is one really important lesson. And I don't think that you have to be too political to just, yeah. I don't think Keir Starmer's going down that route though, so.
I mean, the governments have not been held to account for delivering housing as a human right, which is what it is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Follow the money. See
Follow
who's
the money, yeah,
financing the Tory
because,
party,
yeah,
and you'll understand why volume house builders have such a big say in policies.
Absolutely, because a house is not a house, a place to live, is a financial asset.
Yeah, and I'll leave you with a term that I learned, which for me completely shifts the way I understand housing and the problem with housing. We all know about banking, and we all know about the strength of the financial sector, but there's something within the planning field and the policymakers called land banking, and it's a huge problem. It's a huge problem. It's what's basically driving the purchase of land, the sale of land, and the planning permissions for large estates. And it's the act of buying land and banking it, sitting on it, to fatten the value, get planning application processed, never with the intention of building, but of increasing the value of land so that the next volume house builder will buy the plot next door, do the exact same thing, and a small silent competition begins of grossly inflated land values where no one is building. And it's called land banking. It's a legitimate term, it's known about, and no one has done anything about it because it's just too controversial. And I don't think the media talk about land banking that much. For me, it was a real revelation, the idea of land banking.
Before Patty wraps up, I want to thank you again, first of all, Ellie. And I want to thank Patty for hosting you, and my colleagues, and Stephanie had to go, but she organizes quite a lot. And thank you guys for being here. We have one more lecture in 2 weeks where we reach the planetary scale, and we are going to be talking about maintenance AI and the Planet, and that is with Stephanie Sherman on the 30th of November. But now, Patty, do you want to wrap up?
Yeah, just to wrap up, the last question is, your studio is made up of women. Is that accidental?
It's 100% accidental. And I've been asked a few times, why is it? And, you know, when I have had to fill or find someone for the team, I interview different people, and it just happens that the best skilled and the person most qualified for the job at that time was a woman, and men are welcome in the studio. And we have interns, we have 4 different work experience students that come throughout the year, and we have had boys in the studio, men. But I'm waiting to hear the interview where a bloke gets asked why his office only has men. And it's not against your question, but I just haven't heard it yet.
That's a good answer. Thank you, Helena.
Thank you guys for coming on a Thursday.